On the 11th of October 1973, a small electronics shop opened in Hall Green, Birmingham. It was called Tandy, white letters on a red sign, and it sold components, hi-fi equipment, and kits. Within 2 years, there were over 100. By 1988, there were more than 400 locations across Britain. At its peak, Tandy had a shop on almost every major high street in the country, nearly 2,000 staff, and a mailing list that was one of the largest in British retail. In January 1999, Carphone Warehouse bought the entire operation, 270 shops, stock included, for £9 million. Not for the brand, not for the customers, for the leases. By 2001, every shop was gone. Between those two dates sits a story about electronics, about hobbyists, about a culture of building and fixing, and about what happens when the world moves on. We tell the stories of what Britain built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. Picture a shop, not a big one. A compact unit on the high street, wedged between the chemist and the building society. The sign above the door said Tandy, white letters on red, and if you were a certain kind of person, the kind who owned a soldering iron or wanted to, that sign was a beacon. You'd push through the door and the first thing you'd notice was the display at the front. Realistic hi-fi separates stacked along one wall, speakers either side, music playing, sometimes loud enough that you could hear it from the pavement. Remote control cars unboxed on a table. Batteries already loaded, ready for a go. Cordless phones in their cradles. Walkie-talkies standing upright in blister packs. A scanner chattering quietly with police and emergency frequencies. The little red LED blinking as it swept through the bands. At Christmas, the front of the shop was transformed, piled high with electronic toys and gadgets, the kind of things that ran on 4 AA batteries and gave a 12-year-old something to do until Boxing Day. Unboxed demo models sat on top of the displays, switched on, inviting you to press a button and see what happened. But the real draw was at the back, or sometimes along one side, depending on the layout of that particular shop. Rows and rows of small drawers and blister pack components hanging from hooks on a pegboard wall. Resistors and little paper strips sorted by value. Capacitors, electrolytic, ceramic, polyester, in small bags. LEDs in red, green, and amber, each one in its own tiny blister pack with a product code and a price sticker. Transistors, diodes, voltage regulators, toggle switches, rotary switches with satisfying clicks, lengths of ribbon cable in rainbow colors, crocodile clips with red and black insulation, rolls of multi-core solder, heat shrink tubing, soldering irons and replacement tips, PCB etching kits, project boxes in gray or black plastic in half a dozen sizes, Vero board, the copper-striped prototyping board that smelled faintly of fiberglass when you cut it. All of it sold individually or in small packs at prices that a schoolboy with 2 pounds pocket money could just about manage. One customer from the 1980s put it simply. On £2 a week, he could afford a single LED. If he'd cut the grass that week, maybe a flashing one. And he was perfectly happy with that. Because what he was really buying wasn't a component. It was the next piece of whatever he was building at home on the bedroom desk, surrounded by scorch marks on the carpet from the soldering iron, and a practical electronics magazine propped open to the circuit diagram. Then there were the kits. The science fair range, 101, 150-1, 201, were Tandy's great gateway drug. They came in flat plastic cases about the size of a large book, with a printed circuit board dotted with spring terminals inside. No soldering required. You'd follow the numbered diagrams in the manual, run wires between the springs, and build a working circuit. A radio, an alarm, a light-activated switch, a Morse code oscillator, a rain detector, a simple amplifier, dozens of projects from the same board, each one slightly more complex than the last. The manual explained what each component did, in language a 10-year-old could follow. It was electronics education disguised as a toy. One man traced his entire career back to those kits. He started with the spring terminals and the 101, progressed to soldered kits from the same shop, little FM transmitters, power supply boards, amplifier modules, Then he discovered computing, merged the two interests together, and ended up a maintenance electrician. Tandy to career, step by step, with a science fair board as the first rung on the ladder. He wasn't unusual. That pipeline, from science fair kit to soldering iron to career in engineering or IT, ran through thousands of lives. It was never formally measured, and nobody at Tandy's head office in Walsall was tracking it. But it was real, and the people who went through it remember exactly where it started. The staff, in those early years at least, tended to know what they were talking about. They could tell you what value resistor you needed for your circuit. They could explain why your project wasn't working and suggest what to try instead. They'd look at your shopping list, recognize the project. That's the FM transmitter from this month's Everyday Electronics, isn't it? And know whether you'd got everything you needed or were missing a component. They weren't engineers, they were shop assistants, mostly young, mostly male, working class or lower middle class, earning somewhere around 80 to 120 pounds a week by the mid-1980s. But they understood what they were selling, and that mattered enormously. It was the difference between a shop and a parts counter. Walk into Tandy with a half-built project and a puzzled expression, and someone behind the counter would usually have a suggestion. Walk in knowing exactly what you needed, and they'd help you find it in the drawers without fuss. That quality didn't last, and it's worth being honest about it. By the mid-1990s, as the product range shifted toward consumer electronics and the pressure to sell extended warranties intensified, the knowledgeable hobbyist behind the counter was increasingly replaced by a general retail worker who knew the till but not the stock. One customer from that era recalled the distinction bluntly. Tandy was staffed by salespeople, while Maplin had the genuine experts. A Google Groups poster from around the year 2000 was harsher still, recommending people avoid Tandy entirely because the staff were, in his words, completely clueless. The decline in staff knowledge mirrored the decline in the product range. As the components shrank to a back corner and the consumer electronics took over the floor space, there was less reason to employ someone who understood Ohm's law and more reason to employ someone who could sell a TandyCare warranty. There was a ritual to buying anything at Tandy, however small. The assistant wrote your receipt by hand on a pad. There were no electronic tills until around 1990. Carbon copies, a top sheet for you, a duplicate for the shop. And before you could leave, they'd ask for your name and address, every single time. Didn't matter if you were buying a 50-pence battery clip or a 300-pound hi-fi receiver. Name and address, please. It went on to the mailing list, which was the engine of the entire operation. That list meant the catalog would arrive at your door uninvited, which meant you'd spend the next fortnight circling things you couldn't afford and working out which ones you could. The monthly newsletter followed, featuring reductions of sometimes 50%, clearance prices on last season's stock that made an already affordable hobby even cheaper. The name and address business caused a fair bit of grumbling. Plenty of customers resented it, especially if they were buying something small and in a hurry. But it worked. Tandy's mailing list was one of the largest direct marketing databases in British retail. Every name was a future catalog recipient. Every catalog was a sales call that cost a few pence in postage and printing. And then there was the free battery club. You'd sign up in the shop and receive a small cardboard card, wallet-sized, with 12 boxes printed on it, one for each month of the year. Every month you could walk into your local Tandy and claim one free battery. Just one. A single AA or a C or a D or a 9-volt PP3. The batteries were zinc carbon, the cheap sort, not alkaline, branded Intercell or RadioShack. The salesperson would tick off that month's box with a biro. The genius was in the maths. One battery powers almost nothing on its own. A transistor radio needs at least 2. A Walkman takes 2. A remote control car needs 4 or 6. So you'd come in for your free battery and leave having bought 3 more at full price, plus the car, plus the batteries for the car, plus a roll of solder you just noticed on the way to the till. It was a footfall engine disguised as a loyalty scheme, and it ran from the 1960s right through to the early 1990s. One blogger called his free battery club card your gateway to untold wealth. Well, 12 free batteries a year maybe? Another recalled the satisfaction of presenting the card each month, collecting his single zinc carbon cell, and walking out having spent nothing. The staff, presumably, were less delighted by those visits. The catalog itself was something else entirely. In the early days of Tandy's UK operation, the mid 1970s, shops used the full American RadioShack catalog, completely unedited. It was enormous. On hundreds of pages of hi-fi equipment, car accessories, tools, test equipment, components, amateur radio gear, and consumer electronics, much of it unavailable in Britain and priced in dollars. One enthusiast remembered it vividly, the full American version, with an incredible range of gear that would never appear in a UK shop, and at its absolute pinnacle, the realistic range of CB radio equipment, which in the late 1970s was still entirely illegal in Britain, making the pages even more tantalizing. You could look at photographs of equipment you couldn't legally use, read the specifications, imagine owning it, and then turn the page to the shortwave receivers, which you could. Later, UK-specific catalogs replaced the American originals. They were published annually, with seasonal sale supplements, and they were substantial documents, not quite Maplin thick, but serious enough to browse for an evening. They were delivered by post to every address on the compulsory mailing list and available free in shops. Original catalogs from 1980 onwards are now archived online at tandyonline.com and sell for 10 to 60 pounds on eBay. Collector's items from a shop that no longer exists. The customers were a particular tribe, though they'd never have described themselves that way. Radio hams browsed the realistic shortwave receivers, the DX series, and the patrolman scanning range, which let you eavesdrop on police, fire, ambulance, and aircraft frequencies. Serious amateurs bought their main transmitting equipment from specialist dealers selling Yaesu, ICOM, and Kenwood, but Tandy was where you'd pick up the accessories. Coaxial cable, connectors, SWR meters, headphones, power supplies. The Radio Society of Great Britain had been the custodian of British amateur radio since 1913, and Tandy was part of that wider world without ever being its center. Fathers and sons, and it was almost always fathers and sons, did the Saturday morning Tandy run as part of the weekly shop. Mum might be in Boots or Woolworths. Dad and the lad would be in Tandy, looking at the new stock, checking the reduced items, and arguing about whether this was the week to buy the receiver they'd been eyeing for 3 months. One man recalled that no Christmas shopping trip was complete without at least one visit to Tandy. Even if there was no chance of a present from there that year, he'd drag his mum inside just to have a look. If his dad was there, no dragging was required. His dad would already be headed through the door, one step ahead, making straight for the hi-fi separates. Schoolboys bought components for CDT projects, craft, design, and technology, the curriculum subject that for a brief period required secondary school pupils to actually build electronic circuits, a flashing LED circuit, a moisture sensor, an amplifier. The components came from Tandy or from Maplin if you were organized enough to order by post, or from the school's own stock if you were lucky. Tandy was the emergency option, the shop you went to on Saturday when you just realized your project was due on Monday and you were missing 3 resistors and a 555 timer. CB radio enthusiasts flocked to Tandy after legalization in 1981, and we'll come to that. And then there was the broader category, tinkerers and fixers and people who simply liked knowing how things worked, people who repaired their own televisions, people who built their own speakers, people who wired their own doorbells, their own house alarms, their own intercoms, people who, when something broke, opened the back to have a look before considering a replacement. This was a substantial portion of the British population, and Tandy served them all. For some young people, Tandy was more than a shop. It was a refuge. One man, looking back on his teenage years, described how his life divided neatly in two. Most of his peers were at the sports pavilion, or at house parties, or hanging around in ways he found pointless and unappealing. He was at Tandy, chatting to the manager, building speaker systems from Tandy components, or earning pocket money, fixing neighbors' electrical items, and enjoying electronics with a few other like-minded souls he knew. He looked back on that choice with absolute certainty. He'd made the right call. The sports pavilion led nowhere. The Tandy counter led to a career. Tandy even had enough cultural weight to turn up in British comedy. Alan Partridge's shopping trip to the Tandy in Norwich, in Knowing Me Knowing Yule, became a touchstone for a generation who recognized exactly what kind of shop it was and exactly what kind of person shopped there. You didn't need the joke explained. If you'd been to a Tandy, you knew. If you hadn't, it probably wasn't your kind of program. And that's what Tandy was, at its core, a place where curiosity had somewhere to go. Where a 10-year-old could walk in with a pound coin and walk out with a handful of components and a vague idea of what to do with them. Where a hobby that lived in bedrooms and garden sheds and under the stairs had a physical home on the high street. Where the question, what does this do, had an answer you could buy for 40 pence and find out for yourself. Now, to understand how a chain of small electronics shops ended up on nearly every high street in Britain, you need to understand where it came from and the broader ecosystem that made it viable. Tandy Corporation started life in 1919 as a leather goods company in Fort Worth, Texas, about as far from electronics as you can get. The Hinckley Tandy Leather Company sold hides and leather craft supplies. The transformation came in 1963 when Charles David Tandy, the founder's son, a born salesman with an instinct for retail, bought RadioShack, a near-bankrupt electronics mail-order firm based in Boston, for roughly $300,000. It was a bargain. RadioShack had a loyal customer base, a catalog operation, and the beginnings of a retail network. What it lacked was money and management. Tandy supplied both. Within a decade, RadioShack had thousands of shops across America, and Tandy Corporation began looking overseas. The first non-American shop opened in Artselaar, Belgium, on the 9th of August 1973. 2 months later, on the 11th of October, the first British shop opened in Hall Green, Birmingham. It traded under the name Tandy, not RadioShack. Yeah, the reason was straightforward and slightly comic. A small independent electronics shop on Finchley Road in London already held the RadioShack name in Britain. Tandy reportedly offered a vast sum to buy it. The owner refused, and so, for the entire 26-year lifespan of the chain in Britain, it was Tandy, a name that meant leather in Texas and electronics in Wolverhampton. The UK head office was established at Tandy Centre, Leamore Lane, Bloxwich, in Walsall, deep in the West Midlands, not London. A repair centre operated out of Wednesbury, a few miles down the road. The distribution warehouse was in the same area. From that Black Country base, the chain grew at a speed that suggests genuine demand, not just corporate ambition. By the mid-1970s, barely 2 years after the first shop opened, there were over 100 locations. By 1988, there were 234 company-owned shops and another 206 independent dealer outlets, roughly 440 locations across Britain where you could buy a Tandy product. The dealer network is worth understanding. These weren't franchises in the modern sense. They were independent shopkeepers, often in smaller towns where the footfall wouldn't justify a full company-owned branch, who stocked a range of Tandy products alongside their own merchandise. A typical dealer might be an existing electrical shop or TV repair business that added a Tandy components display and consumer electronics range. The company-owned high street shops had the full catalog. The dealers had a narrower selection, but between them they achieved coverage that few specialist retailers could match. You didn't need to live in a city to find a Tandy product. If your town had a dealer, you had access to the range, and if they didn't have it in stock, they could order it. In June 1986, Tandy Corporation spun off all its international operations into a separate company called Intertan Inc., listed on the New York Stock Exchange. At the point of separation, Intertan had estimated annual sales of $400 million, assets of $250 million, and accounted for 13% of the parent company's total revenue. The UK operating entity was Intertan UK Limited, still traceable on Companies House today, registration number 02191786. Intertan's first year was rocky, a loss of $12.5 million across the whole group, but the turnaround was dramatic. By 1988, the company was reporting a net profit of nearly $24 million, and the UK operation was described by management as its shining star. British sales accounted for almost 16% of the group's total turnover, with year-on-year growth of 33% and a profit increase of 127%. That's not incremental growth. That's a business finding its market. A succession of managing directors ran the UK operation from Walsall with considerable autonomy from the American parent. John Sayers, Michael Murray, Eamon Bradley from July 1995, and finally Andrew Fryatt, who would oversee the restructuring and eventual sale. The UK wasn't just following American orders. It had its own catalog, its own marketing, its own seasonal rhythm. The Christmas peak, when remote control cars, walkie-talkies, and electronic toys drove a disproportionate share of annual revenue, was managed from Walsall, not Fort Worth. The product range was built almost entirely on own brand labels, and there were a remarkable number of them. Realistic was the flagship, covering hi-fi and audio equipment, receivers, cassette decks, turntables, reel-to-reel tape machines, and speakers. The brand originated in 1954 in the American RadioShack operation and ran until 1994. Much of the Realistic range was OEM, manufactured in Japan by companies like Hitachi and Teak, then rebadged. Some of it was rather good, more than rather good in some cases. One enthusiast reckoned certain Realistic reel-to-reel decks were actually superior to the Teak-branded equivalents they shared a factory with. Another claimed some Realistic amplifiers had Pioneer internals, the same circuit boards, the same components, the same sound, in a different case with a different badge, at a lower price. Whether these claims are precisely accurate is hard to verify decades later, but the sentiment is consistent. Realistic gear punched above its weight, and people who owned it often had a quiet pride in knowing that they'd got something good without paying the premium brand price. The Mach 1 loudspeakers, with their 15-inch woofers, were a serious bit of kit, not audiophile grade, but capable of filling a room at volumes that would concern the neighbors. The Minimus 7, a compact metal-cased monitor speaker barely bigger than a paperback, became something of a cult object, prized for its clarity relative to its size. The Optimus range covered additional speakers and turntables. ConcertMate made synthesizers and keyboards, not professional instruments, but entry-level machines that let a teenager discover what a synthesizer could do. Duophone covered telephones and answering machines. Even the recording tape had its own brand, Super Tape. And the batteries, of course, were inner cell. It was a self-contained ecosystem. You could walk into Tandy, buy every component of a complete hi-fi system: receiver, turntable, cassette deck, speakers, cables, a tape to record onto, and everything would have a Tandy brand on it. Nothing wrong with that. The quality was decent, the prices were competitive, and the staff could explain how it all connected together, which was more than could be said for most department stores selling hi-fi at the time. Micronta covered test equipment: multimeters, soldering stations, bench power supplies. These were the tools of the hobby. A Micronta multimeter was often a young hobbyist's first serious instrument, the thing that turned guesswork into measurement, that let you test whether a resistor was the right value or whether the voltage across a circuit was what it should be. Archer handled components, cables, and connectors, the bread and butter of the component drawers, and Science Fair produced the educational kits that started so many careers. In 1978, Tandy brought the TRS-80 home computer to Britain. It deserves more than a passing mention, because for a brief window, Tandy was selling the future over the counter. The TRS-80 Model 1 launched in America in August 1977, the same year as the Apple II and the Commodore Pete. It used a Zilog Z80 processor running at 1.77 MHz with 4 kilobytes of RAM expandable to 16, and it displayed text on a modified black and white television. In America, it was a sensation. RadioShack couldn't make them fast enough. The machine reached British Tandy shops by 1978, with the 16 kilobyte Model 1 Level 2 selling for approximately £500 to £550, over $3,000 in today's money. The top-of-the-range Model 2, aimed at small businesses, had 32 kilobytes and a built-in floppy disk drive and cost £2,000, roughly $13,000 today. These were not impulse purchases. Tandy took the computer seriously. They opened dedicated TRS-80 microcomputer centers in Bradford, Bristol, Birmingham, and Manchester, shops within shops, or sometimes standalone units, staffed by people who could demonstrate the machine and help new owners get started. A British user group, NATGUG, the National Tandy/TRS-80 User Group, sprang up and published newsletters. A dedicated website, trs-80.org.uk, still operates in Britain today, maintained by enthusiasts who remember the machine with genuine affection. Third-party UK suppliers like Molomerks produced peripherals, printers, memory expansions, interface boards, specifically for British TRS-80 owners. But the TRS-80's moment in Britain was brief, and the reason was price. Within a few years, far cheaper British machines had arrived. The Sinclair ZX80 in 1980 at £99 for the kit, or $150 assembled, a quarter of the cost of a basic TRS-80. The ZX Spectrum in 1982 from £125, out with color graphics and sound that the TRS-80 couldn't match. The BBC Micro in 1981 from £235, backed by the BBC's Computer Literacy Project and adopted by schools across the country, giving it an institutional legitimacy that no American import could compete with. The Commodore 64, also 1982, at under £200. Against that avalanche of cheap, capable British-designed machines, a £500 American computer with an American keyboard layout, American documentation, and a monochrome display was never going to capture the mass market. The TRS-80 found its niche: small businesses, dedicated hobbyists, people who valued the extensive software library and the support network. But it never became a household name in Britain the way the Spectrum and the BBC Micro did. Tandy continued selling computers through the 1980s. The color computer, the Model 100 laptop, the Tandy 1000 PC clone. But computers were never the core of the UK business in the way they were in America. What was the core for one glorious year was CB radio. And for a brief extraordinary period, Tandy found itself at the very center of British popular culture. Citizens Band radio had been legal in America since the 1940s, and by the late 1970s, it had crossed the Atlantic as a cultural phenomenon long before it crossed as a legal reality. C.W. McCall's Convoy reached number 2 in the UK charts in the 1976, a novelty trucker anthem built entirely on CB slang. Smokey and the Bandit arrived in cinemas in 1977 and did enormous business. The trucker mystique, Handles, Channel 19, 10-4 Good Buddy, Ah Rubber Duck, and Smokey Bear captivated a certain kind of Briton, mostly male, mostly working class, and mostly determined to get on the air whether the government liked it or not. The government didn't like it. CB radio was illegal in the UK under the Wireless Telegraphy Act. Using an unlicensed transmitter was a criminal offense. But enforcement was patchy, and the demand was overwhelming. By 1980, an estimated 300 to 500,000 people were using illegal American specification AM sets, imported, home-built, or cobbled together from kits, to chat with strangers, coordinate with fellow drivers, and generally enjoy a form of communication that felt thrillingly personal and completely outside official channels. The campaign for legalization was loud, well-organized, and persistent. Petitions went to Parliament. Rallies were held. The National Committee for the Legalization of CB radio lobbied hard. On the 2nd of November 1981, the Home Office finally gave in, but on specifically British terms. 40 channels on 27 MHz FM, deliberately incompatible with the American AM system, so that the hundreds of thousands of existing illegal sets couldn't simply be switched to legal use. The government wanted a clean break, and the FM specification achieved it. A license cost £15 from the post office. You didn't need an exam, you didn't need a call sign, you just bought the license, bought the radio, and you were on the air. Tandy was ready. The realistic TRC range of transceivers, purpose-built for the new UK specification, was on the shelves before the ink was dry on the legislation. Base stations, mobile units for cars, handheld portables. Tandy published a dedicated Tandy CB guide in 1981, a slim booklet walking new users through etiquette, channel usage, the phonetic alphabet, 10 codes, and the basics of radio communication. It was a masterpiece of accessible instruction, clear enough for a complete novice, detailed enough to be genuinely useful. CB was one of the biggest selling Christmas presents of 1981. Cues formed outside Tandy shops and electronic retailers across the country. The culture was everywhere: handles, breaker channels, good buddy greetings exchanged between complete strangers, a nationwide community of voices that existed only on the airwaves. For a few months, CB felt like the future of personal communication. It wasn't. The novelty wore off with remarkable speed. The channels filled with abuse, interference, and dead air. The skip, long distance signals bouncing off the ionosphere, and overwhelming local communications made some frequencies unusable. The equipment was often poor quality, and the fundamental limitation became apparent. CB only works if someone else is listening, and increasingly nobody was. By the following Christmas, sets were being given away free with purchases of other goods, the clearest possible signal that the market had collapsed. Mobile phones were still a decade away from mass adoption, but when they arrived, they finished off what remained of CB culture. The realistic TRC 1001, a handheld 40-channel 4-watt transceiver that sold in its thousands, is now a museum piece held in the Science Museum Group's collection, a relic of a craze that burned white-hot and vanished within 18 months. Through all of this, computers, CB, hi-fi, components, kits, Tandy sat at the center of a broader hobbyist ecosystem that was, for a time, genuinely flourishing. It's worth understanding that ecosystem because Tandy didn't exist in isolation. It was one node in a network, and the network was what kept the whole culture alive. Monthly magazines fueled the hobby. Practical Electronics, founded in November 1964, published circuit diagrams and construction projects for intermediate builders. Everyday Electronics, launched in November 1971, served the beginner. Simpler projects, clearer explanations, more hand-holding. Practical Wireless catered to the radio crowd: transmitters, receivers, aerials, propagation. Elector, originally Dutch, ran a UK edition with more ambitious designs. Electronics Today. International came from Australia and found a British readership. Hobby Electronics was another entry point. Wireless World served the more theoretically minded, and Maplin published its own magazine, Electronics, the Maplin magazine, featuring full construction articles with component lists that cross-referenced to Maplin's own catalog numbers. There was a pipeline, and it was beautifully simple. You'd buy the magazine from the newsagent, read the project article, study the circuit diagram, copy out the component list, walk into Tandy or Maplin or the local independent with your list, buy what you needed, go home, build it, and if it didn't work, which happened often enough, you'd troubleshoot, check the soldering, check the component values, reread the article, try again. The knowledge was cumulative. Each project taught you something the next one needed. The progression was natural, from science fair spring terminal kit to simple soldered project, to complex construction to original design. Thousands of people followed that path. It was informal, self-directed, driven by curiosity rather than curriculum, and it produced a generation of people who understood electronics from the component level up. Maplin Electronic Supplies, founded in 1972 in Rayleigh, Essex, by Roger Allen, Sandra Allen, and Doug Simmons, was Tandy's closest competitor and, in the view of many enthusiasts, the more serious operation. Maplin started as a 28-page mail-order catalog. Born from the founders' frustration at the difficulty of sourcing components for their own projects, their catalogs grew into legendary documents, phone book thick, with science fiction spaceship artwork on the covers, sold at W.H. Smith and other newsagents for a few pounds. Hundreds of thousands of copies sold. The range was wider than Tandy's. The data sheets were more detailed. The technical specifications more precise. As one hobbyist put it bluntly, once he discovered Maplin's mail-order catalog, it was the middle finger to Tandy from that point on. He wasn't alone in that sentiment. For the serious builder, Maplin was the specialist's choice. But Maplin started as mail-order and was slower to the high street. Their first physical shop didn't open until the mid-1980s. For instant gratification, the resistor you needed this afternoon, not next Wednesday by post, Tandy was unbeatable. That was its unique advantage. It was there, on the high street, open now. You could walk in, buy what you needed, and be home building within the hour. The other competitors occupied different positions. RS Components, originally radio spares, and Farnell served the professional and trade market with vast catalogs, next-day delivery, and minimum order values that discouraged casual hobbyists. Rapid Electronics offered mail order at slightly more accessible price points, and then there were the independents, the local shops that are almost impossible to document because they left so little trace. In the 1970s and 1980s, it was entirely normal for a small British town to have 2 or 3 independent electronics component shops alongside its Tandy. These were often eccentric, wonderful places. Surplus dealers selling ex-military equipment at knockdown prices, oscilloscopes, signal generators, odd mysterious boxes with bakelite knobs and military part numbers. One-man operations run from a back room or a converted garage where the owner knew more about RF design than some university lecturers and would happily spend 20 minutes explaining impedance matching to a puzzled teenager. They're all gone now, every single one. By the mid-1980s, Tandy had over 340 company-owned shops. At the high water mark, around 1995, the number was 341. There was one on almost every major high street in the country, in Birmingham and Brighton, Liverpool and Lancaster, York and Norwich, Kilburn and Cannock, Peterborough and Rochdale, Staines and Sittingbourne, Abingdon and Arnold. It was such a reliable landmark that people gave directions by it. Take a left at the Tandy. You'd know which shop they meant. At peak, the staff numbered close to 2,000 across those stores, roughly 6 per shop. The business model was simple, well-tested, and profitable. Own brand goods at competitive margins, a massive mailing list, a battery club that brought customers through the door every month, a Christmas season that generated a disproportionate share of annual revenue, and a component range that served a loyal hobbyist base who returned week after week. In 1988, the UK operation alone posted a profit increase of 127%. It seemed for a while like the model could run forever. It couldn't. The first cracks were not obvious from the shop floor. They were structural. Deep shifts in technology, manufacturing, and consumer behavior that would take a decade to fully play out, but were already, by the late 1980s, on undermining the foundations of everything Tandy depended on. The most fundamental was the change in how electronics were manufactured. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, most consumer devices used through-hole components, parts with wire legs that passed through holes drilled in a printed circuit board and were soldered on the other side. These components were substantial, visible objects. A resistor was a small cylinder with colored bands painted around it, each band representing a digit, so you could read the resistance value at a glance. A capacitor had its rating printed on the side in numbers anyone could understand. A transistor had 3 legs and a flat face with a part number you could look up in a data book. These were components a hobbyist could see, handle, identify, desolder, test with a cheap multimeter, and replace. The ability to do this, to open the back of a broken radio, look at the circuit board, identify the failed component by its scorch mark or cracked case, desolder it, walk into Tandy, buy a replacement for 30 pence, solder it in, and have a working radio again, was the foundational skill of the entire hobbyist culture. And it was the reason Tandy's component drawers existed. Surface mount technology changed everything. SMT had existed since the 1960s, but became commercially dominant through the late 1980s and 1990s as manufacturing automated. Surface mount components are tiny. Resistors and capacitors can be smaller than a grain of rice, some no bigger than a grain of sand. They mount flat on pads on the surface of the board. No wire legs, no color bands, no printed values visible to the naked eye. Pin spacings of 0.5 millimeter or less. Hand soldering them requires specialist equipment. Fine-tipped irons, magnification, flux, tweezers, a steady hand, and considerable practice. As one veteran hobbyist put it with evident frustration, how can a hobbyist work with surface mount parts when they don't even put color bands on the resistors anymore? As manufacturers shifted to surface mount, driven by the enormous cost and space savings it offered, the devices people bought became progressively impossible to repair at home. Open the back of a 1970s transistor radio, and you'd see a circuit board you could understand. Open the back of a 1990s portable CD player, and you'd see a dense green board covered in components so small they looked like specks of dirt. The components in Tandy's drawers were still perfectly good. They were still the right values, still the right specifications. They just weren't the components inside anything you owned anymore. Through-hole parts are increasingly difficult to source today as manufacturers prioritize surface mount production lines. The drawer of resistors at the back of the Tandy served a world that was quietly ceasing to exist. At the same time, the economics of consumer electronics were shifting beneath the entire repair culture. Devices got cheaper, relentlessly. A portable radio that would once have justified an hour's diagnosis and a 30-pence component now cost less than the technician's time to open the case. It was cheaper to buy a new one. Throw it away. The calculation was the same for cassette players, clock radios, personal stereos, portable televisions. When the cost of replacement drops below the cost of repair, repair dies. And with it, the need for replacement components. And with that, the need for a shop that sold them. The personal computer played its part too. Ironically, Tandy had been one of the pioneers with the TRS-80, but the rise of home computing through the 1980s drew young people from hardware to software. Programming replaced soldering as the entry point into technology. The bedroom hobbyist was still there, still curious, still building things, still staying up too late. But now he was writing basic or machine code, not winding transformers or etching circuit boards. The migration from atoms to bits was gradual but relentless. By the 1990s, the internet accelerated it further. The screen replaced the workbench, and by the mid-1990s, the internet was beginning to reshape retail itself. Farnell and RS Components launched online ordering systems. eBay appeared in 1995. Within a decade, you could order any component ever manufactured from a warehouse in Shenzhen and have it delivered to your door for pennies, with free shipping, in 3 weeks. AliExpress and Banggood would complete the transformation in the 2000s. No physical shop, however well stocked, however conveniently located, could compete on range with a global supply chain that held millions of line items in stock. Tandy tried to adapt. Through the 1990s, the product mix shifted heavily toward consumer electronics. Remote control cars became a larger part of the floor space. Cordless phones, personal stereos, boom boxes, extended warranties, Tandy Care were pushed aggressively on every sale. A store credit card, the Tandy card, was introduced. Mobile phone contracts appeared on the shelves, though Tandy lacked the expertise and the network deals that dedicated mobile retailers like Carphone Warehouse and Phones for You were building. The component drawers stayed, but they shrank. They moved further to the back. They were no longer the reason most people walked through the door. In 1995, the RadioShack brand was launched in UK stores alongside the existing Tandy branding, a signal that the parent company was trying to align the international identity, but also a sign that the Tandy name alone was no longer enough to drive footfall. The quality problem couldn't be ignored either. One former employee from the mid-1990s described the experience as soul-destroying. Selling cheap consumer electronics in the run-up to Christmas was bad enough. Facing a queue of returns the moment the shops reopened after Boxing Day was worse. His manager, he claimed, told him bluntly that Tandy UK had become the outlet for everything the American operation couldn't shift. All the crap the US couldn't sell, was the phrase. He was relieved in the end to leave and work in a supermarket. That's quite a verdict on a shop that had once been the hobbyist's sanctuary. In January 1998, the axe fell for the first time. Intertan closed 69 of its 338 UK shops and cut around 230 jobs. Managing Director Andrew Fryatt cited the changing retail environment, a phrase that covered a multitude of specific problems. The remaining 269 stores and roughly 1,600 employees were put up for sale. They found a buyer, but not the kind the brand deserved. In January 1999, Carphone Warehouse bought the entire UK Tandy operation, roughly 270 shops with all remaining stock, for £9 million. £9 million for 270 shops on high streets across Britain. That's about £33,000 per shop, stock and all. For context, £9 million in 1999 would barely buy you a row of terraced houses in South London. The price told you everything you needed to know about the state of the business. It was a fire sale, a clearance, a closing down price for a going concern that had stopped going. Carphone Warehouse didn't want Tandy. It wanted Tandy's leases, 270 high street locations, I'd already fitted out with counters and shelving in towns across Britain, exactly the kind of property portfolio that a rapidly expanding mobile phone retailer needed. David Ross, co-founder and finance director of Carphone Warehouse, led the acquisition. As one technology journalist put it at the time, the purchase wasn't about preserving Britain's electrical and component subculture. It was about getting high street presence at a fraction of the normal cost. The conversion was swift and thorough. 69 stores were closed immediately. Of the remaining 200, approximately one-third were converted to Carphone Warehouse outlets. Others became branches of Techno Photographic, a camera retailer that was itself later absorbed into Jessop's. By January 2001, on 220 of the 269 stores had been converted or shuttered. The Tandy stock was sold off. Clearance sales, job lots, whatever it took to empty the shelves and make room for mobile phone displays. A handful of stores survived in an unexpected form. 3 former Intertan employees, Dave Johnson, Neil Duggins, and Philip Butcher, pooled their resources and formed a company called T2 Retail Limited. They purchased approximately 11 of the remaining stores, mostly at motorway service stations, and tried to keep the format alive. Components on the wall, consumer electronics on the shelves, a RadioShack style operation for the few remaining customers who still wanted what Tandy had once provided. They lasted until 2005. Then they too were gone. By mid-2001, there was not a single Tandy-branded shop left on a British high street. One last outpost survived in an unlikely form. A RadioShack-branded shop in Lytham St. Anne's, on the Lancashire coast, apparently unconnected to the main Intertan chain, continued trading until around 2019. And in 2012, a new company acquired the Tandy brand and launched TandyOnline.com, selling components by mail order. It has no connection to the original operation, no link to Intertan or Tandy Corporation. But the name, at least, survives on a website. In Hitchin, in Hertfordshire, a shop was being refurbished in 2016, and the builders pulled the modern fascia off the front. Behind it, preserved like a fossil in sedimentary rock, was the old Tandy sign. Still there, 20 years after the shop had closed. Still white on red. Still perfectly readable. Nobody had bothered to remove it. They'd just built over the top. It's a peculiarly British form of archaeology. The ghost sign, the palimpsest of the high street, where the present is just a thin layer of paint over everything that came before. The irony of the Carphone Warehouse takeover deserves a moment's attention. The company consumed Tandy to feed its expansion across the high street. It converted those 270 leases into a national mobile phone empire. Then, in April 2020, Carphone Warehouse itself closed all 531 of its standalone UK shops and retreated entirely from the high street. The predator followed the prey into extinction, barely 2 decades later. The very forces that killed the component shop, the shift to online retail, the hollowing of the high street, the changing economics of physical retail consumed the mobile phone shop just as thoroughly. If there's a lesson in that, it's probably about the speed of change. Tandy's model lasted 26 years. Carphone Warehouse's lasted 21. Whatever comes next may last less. Tandy wasn't alone in its trajectory. Maplin, the other great name in British hobbyist electronics, followed a parallel path to the same destination, by a different route. From that 28-page mail-order catalog in 1972, Maplin grew into a substantial high street presence. 217 shops by 2017, over 2,300 staff, annual turnover of £236 million, but it was saddled with ruinous debt from a private equity acquisition. Rutland Partners bought Maplin in 2014 for £85 million. The acquisition price ended up as a loan on the company's own balance sheet at an interest rate of 15% per year. Operating profit was roughly £2.5 million. Interest payments exceeded £12 million. The company was earning a modest profit and handing almost all of it, and more, to the lender who had loaded it with debt it never asked for. It's a pattern that's destroyed dozens of British retailers. The company works, the debt doesn't. Maplin entered administration on the 28th of February 2018. It happened to be the same day Toys R Us went into administration, a coincidence the retail press christened Black Wednesday. By the 25th of June 2018, every Maplin shop was closed. 2,500 people lost their jobs. The brand was revived as an online-only operation in 2019. And the physical shops, the places where you could walk in, browse the catalog racks, ask a question, and leave with a bag of components, were gone. So now there is no walk-in electronics component shop on the British High Street. None at all, not one. You can order from Farnell, RS Components, or CPC online and have parts delivered next day. You can buy Arduino boards and Raspberry Pi kits from specialist websites like the Pi Hut and Pimaroni. You can find almost any component ever manufactured on eBay or AliExpress, shipped from Shenzhen for a few pence plus a 3-week wait. The range is vaster than anything Tandy or Maplin could have dreamed of stocking. The prices are lower. The convenience, for anyone comfortable with online ordering, is inarguable. What you can't do is wander in off the street with £2 in your pocket and no particular plan. Pull open a drawer and discover what a transistor is. That required a physical place on a physical high street, and the place is gone. The maker movement has filled part of the gap. Hackspaces and makerspaces have sprung up in cities across Britain. London Hackspace, Sheffield Hardware Hackers and Makers, Norwich Hackspace, Manchester Makerspace, dozens of others, offering shared soldering stations, oscilloscopes, 3D printers, laser cutters, and CNC machines, typically for £15 to £30 a month membership. The Raspberry Pi, designed in Cambridge and manufactured in Wales, has sold tens of millions of units worldwide and put a programmable, a general-purpose computer into schools in a way that consciously echoes the BBC Micro's educational mission from 40 years earlier. The BBC Micro Bit, a tiny programmable board backed by the BBC, Microsoft, and others, has been distributed free to every year 7 pupil in the country. Arduino boards, open source and cheap, have made physical computing accessible to anyone willing to learn. These are genuine achievements, and the people behind them are doing important work, but the maker movement differs fundamentally from the Tandy era in ways that matter. It's self-selecting. You have to know it exists. You have to seek it out, find a hack space, sign up, commit. The thing about Tandy was that it didn't require seeking out. It was just there, on the high street, between the chemist and the building society. You walked past it on the way to the chippy. You wandered in because the window display caught your eye. The barrier to entry was a pound coin and idle curiosity. The journey from what's that to genuine competence could start with a single LED bought on a whim by a 10-year-old who had no idea where it would lead. Meanwhile, in schools, the pipeline has narrowed. When the national curriculum introduced design and technology in 1990, it merged the separate subjects of woodwork, metalwork, and electronics into a single discipline. The intention was good, a broader, more creative approach to making things. But in the decades since, electronics has been squeezed out. The Design and Technology Association has reported schools regularly cutting back on provision, and in the worst cases, removing the subject from the curriculum entirely. The English Baccalaureate Performance Measure, the metric by which secondary schools are judged, doesn't include design and technology, which gives head teachers a powerful incentive to redirect resources towards subjects that do count. Ofsted has criticized schools for leaving students with poor knowledge of electronics and computer-aided design. The generation that grew up with a Tandy on the high street, a soldering iron in the shed, and a subscription to practical electronics is not being replaced at anything like the same rate. The broader pattern is familiar by now to anyone who's watched the British High Street over the past 2 decades. Since 2008, 29 major retail chains have failed, taking nearly 12,000 shops and close to 500,000 jobs with them. Woolworths, BHS Comet, Phones 4U, Jessup's, Maplin. The forces are well understood. Online retail, changing shopping habits, rising rents, punitive business rates, the gravitational pull of Amazon. Predictions from the Center for Retail Research suggest 100,000 of the UK's 220,000 retail premises will have disappeared by 2030, with 40% of all retail spending happening online. Tandy was an early signal of that transformation, one of the first casualties, but it was a signal of something slightly different too, not just a shift in where people shop, but in how people relate to the things they buy, from understanding to consuming, from building to buying, from opening the back to accepting the seal, from asking what's wrong with this and can I fix it, to asking where can I buy a new one? That's not a complaint, it's an observation. The smartphone is a genuinely extraordinary piece of technology, more computing power than the entire TRS-80 range put together, by orders of magnitude, in a device that fits in your pocket and costs less in real terms than a TRS-80 Model 1 did in 1978. The electronics that Tandy sold, individually, from drawers, to be soldered by hand, are now embedded in everything, available to everyone, at prices that would have seemed miraculous in 1983. That's a gain, a significant one. And the right to repair movement, UK regulations introduced in July 2021, with 81% public support for extending them to all electronics, suggests that the pendulum may be starting to swing back, at least a little. What went with Tandy was something quieter, a particular kind of competence that was once widespread and is now rare. The confidence that comes from knowing what's inside the box, from having built something that works, from being the person on the street who can fix a doorbell or wire a plug or diagnose why the radio's humming. A culture where the default response to a broken appliance was to open it up and have a look, not to order a replacement online. A 4-year-old boy once walked past a Tandy advertising board with a transistor circuit symbol on it, the little arrow and the flat bar that represents an NPN junction transistor. He pointed at it and said to his uncle, "Transistor, uncle." The uncle, looking back years later, reflected on how perfectly ordinary that seemed at the time. Of course, a child just turned 4 would recognize a transistor symbol. Everyone's dad had a soldering iron. Everyone's shed had a drawer full of components. It was just the world they lived in. The shop at Hall Green, Birmingham, opened on the 11th of October, 1973. It was a small place, by all accounts. Nothing grand. Nothing that would make you stop and stare from across the road. Just a man behind a counter. Drawers full of components on the wall. A catalog on a rack, and a red and white sign above the door. 26 years later, the whole lot. 270 shops, 1,600 employees, the mailing list, the stock, the brand, the leases, everything, went for £9 million. The sign came down. The drawers were emptied. The mailing list was wiped. The Walsall head office went dark. And on that stretch of High Street where the Tandy used to be, something else appeared. A mobile phone shop, most likely, or a charity shop, or an estate agent, or nothing at all. Just a to let sign in the window, an empty unit, and a faded outline on the brickwork where the red and white lettering used to be. But in Hitchin, behind that modern fascia, the old sign was still there, still white on red, still readable, still waiting for someone to look. If you remember Tandy, the shop on your high street, the catalog that landed on your doormat, the free battery club card in your wallet, the science fair kit you unwrapped on Christmas morning. We'd like to hear from you. What did you buy there? What did you build with it? Did your dad take you, or did you go on your own with your pocket money and a shopping list torn from a magazine? Were you a CB man, a hi-fi man, a components and a soldering iron man? Were you one of the lucky ones who got a TRS-80? Do you still have a realistic receiver gathering dust in the spare room, or a Micronta multimeter in the toolbox, or a drawer full of Tandy-branded resistors that you can't quite bring yourself to throw away? And if you work there, pion menu behind the counter, writing out those receipts by hand, asking every customer for their name and address, marking off the free battery club cards month after month. What was it really like? We'd genuinely like to know. Drop a comment. Your memories are part of this story.